I stood frozen in my own doorway, staring at the chaos that had once been my pristine living room. Cardboard boxes stacked against walls, unfamiliar furniture crammed between my carefully chosen pieces, and my brother Greg sprawled on my couch, beer in hand, watching my television. The spare bedroom door stood open, revealing a complete transformation from my home office to what was clearly his bedroom. My parents smiled nervously from my kitchen, still holding the duplicate keys I never gave them. That sickening moment when I realized they had moved my unemployed brother into my house without asking would change everything about my life forever. The shock of finding Greg already settled into my home felt like being doused with ice water. I had just returned from a 3-day business trip to Chicago, expecting to enjoy a quiet evening in my own space. Instead, I walked into what felt like an alternate universe, where my boundaries meant nothing. "What is going on here?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper as I tried to process the scene before me. My mother rushed forward, hands clasped together in that way she always did when she was about to ask for something unreasonable. "Ida, honey. Surprise. We thought we'd help Greg move in while you were away, so it would all be done when you got back." "Move in." The words felt foreign in my mouth. "Mom, what are you talking about? Nobody discussed anything about Greg moving in with me." My father stepped forward, his expression that familiar mix of stern authority and dismissal that had defined much of my childhood. "Now, Ida, don't make a scene. Your brother lost his apartment after that restaurant let him go. He needs a place to stay until he gets back on his feet." Greg finally looked up from the television, offering a casual wave. "Hey, sis. Thanks for the crash pad. The water pressure in your shower is amazing." The casual way they had invaded my space and made decisions about my home without even a phone call sent waves of both fury and familiar disappointment through me. This pattern wasn't new, it had just never been quite so blatant before. Growing up, Greg had always been the golden child. 2 years older than me, he was the son my father had always wanted, the charming boy who could talk his way out of any trouble, the one whose dreams were always supported with enthusiasm and financial backing. Meanwhile, I worked 2 jobs during high school to save for college because my expensive education would be wasted on marriage anyway. I put myself through state college, then earned a scholarship for my master's in software development. Every achievement I'd earned had come through double the effort Greg ever had to exert. And now, at 34, I had finally created the life I wanted. I had worked my way up to senior developer at a respected tech firm. I had saved for years to buy this 3-bedroom craftsman bungalow in a quiet neighborhood. Every piece of furniture, every paint color had been my careful choice. My home was my sanctuary, the place where I finally felt completely in control. Yet here they were acting as if my space was community property. "How did you even get in?" I asked, though I already suspected the answer. "We've had a spare key for emergencies," my mother said, with a wave of her hand. "Don't worry, we helped Greg clean out his old place too. He didn't have to leave anything behind." I walked further into the living room, surveying the invasion. Greg's ancient recliner that smelled faintly of cigarettes despite his claims he'd quit years ago. His mismatched bookshelves filled with gaming equipment. Boxes labeled stuff in his messy handwriting. "This isn't going to work," I said firmly. "I never agreed to this. Greg needs to find his own place." My mother's face fell into the disappointed expression I knew all too well. "Ida Marie Thompson, I can't believe how selfish you're being right now. Your brother has nowhere else to go. What about his last 3 roommates? Or his girlfriend? Or I don't know your house?" I countered, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. My father's expression darkened. "We don't have the space, you know that. Besides, you have this big house all to yourself. Family helps family, Ida. That's what we raised you to do." Greg finally stood up, stretching casually. "Look, sis, I know this is a surprise, but I'm really in a bind here. I just need a couple weeks to find another job and get my own place. You won't even notice I'm here." I looked between the 3 of them, feeling outnumbered and manipulated as I had countless times throughout my life. A lifetime of conditioning to be the reasonable one, the responsible one, the one who sacrificed, because Greg couldn't be expected to wait on me. 2 weeks, I finally said. That's it, and we need to set some ground rules right now. I laid out my boundaries: no friends over without asking, clean up after himself, quiet after 10 on weeknights, and most importantly, he needed to actively look for work every day. Greg nodded along, looking appropriately grateful, while my parents beamed as if I'd just offered to donate a kidney. After they left promising to check in soon, I sat at my kitchen counter feeling unsettled. Something about the way they had all arrived with keys already made, with everything already moved in, felt pre-planned in a way that made me suspicious. I examined my front door lock more carefully and noticed multiple small scratches around the keyhole that hadn't been there before. That night, after Greg had gone to bed in my former office, I called a 24-hour locksmith and had all the locks changed, keeping the new keys securely in my possession. I said nothing to Greg about it, but I started watching more carefully, wondering what else my family might have planned without my knowledge or consent. 2 weeks passed with alarming speed, and with each day my hope that Greg would stick to our agreement faded. Despite his promises to immediately begin job hunting, his daily routine consisted of sleeping until noon, eating enormous amounts of my food, and parking himself in front of the television or his gaming console until the early hours of the morning. "Did you apply for any jobs today?" I asked one evening, finding him exactly where I'd left him that morning, still in pajama pants surrounded by empty snack bags. "Yeah, sent out like 10 applications," Greg replied without looking away from his game. "Haven't heard anything yet." "Can I see what positions you applied for? Maybe I know someone who could put in a good word." Greg's controller movements faltered slightly. I deleted the emails already, but don't worry, I'm on it." By the beginning of the 3rd week, my patience was wearing thin. I had started documenting everything, making notes of my conversations with Greg, taking photos of the growing mess he left throughout the house, and keeping receipts from the increasingly expensive grocery trips that barely kept my refrigerator stocked. The final straw came when I arrived home from work to find 3 men I'd never seen before playing video games in my living room, beer bottles littering my coffee table, and music blaring so loudly I could hear it from the driveway. "Greg," I shouted over the noise after walking in. "What is this?" The strangers looked up, unfazed by my obvious anger, while Greg emerged from the kitchen with another beer. "Hey sis, these are my buddies from my last job. They came by to tell me about some openings they heard about." He gestured vaguely at the men not bothering to introduce us. "In my house without asking me first, we had an agreement, Greg. Come on, don't be uptight. It's not like you were using the living room while you were at work." He laughed and his friends smirked along with him. After I insisted his friends leave, which they did with exaggerated sighs and eye-rolling, I confronted Greg again. "The 2 weeks are up. Have you found a place yet?" Greg dropped onto the couch, suddenly looking dejected. "Look, I'm trying, but the job market is tough right now. I've got a promising lead at this tech startup, but they're still going through applications. Can you just cut me some slack? We're family." The we're family card, the trump card my parents had taught him to play whenever he needed something from me. Before I could respond, my phone rang. It was my mother. "Ida, your father and I are coming by to check on you and Greg. We'll be there in 20 minutes. Sure enough, they arrived bearing takeout dinner and using the doorbell since their key no longer worked. My father tried the key anyway, before ringing, his expression darkening when he realized the lock had been changed. "Why would you change the locks without telling us?" he demanded, as soon as they were inside. "What if there was an emergency?" "The emergency option is calling me Dad. Not letting yourselves in whenever you want." My mother busied herself setting out the food, pointedly ignoring the tension. "Greg, honey, how's the job search going?" Before he could answer with what I was sure would be more vague assurances, I interrupted. "It's not, and the 2 weeks we agreed to have passed. He needs to find his own place." What followed was a familiar family dynamic, my parents defending Greg, minimizing my concerns, and ultimately pressuring me to extend his stay. "Just until he lands this promising tech job," my mother pleaded. "You know how much potential he has." By the time they left, Greg's stay had somehow been extended indefinitely, and I felt the control over my own home slipping further away. That night I noticed my tablet was missing from its usual spot on my desk. After searching the entire house, I reluctantly knocked on Greg's door. "Have you seen my tablet? I can't find it anywhere." Greg barely glanced up from his phone. "Nope, haven't seen it." Something about his too casual response triggered my suspicion. While he was in the shower the next morning, I quickly searched his room and found nothing. But a nagging feeling led me to check his backpack, tucked partially under the bed. My tablet wasn't there, but I found a crumpled receipt for a pawn shop dated the previous day. Curious, and increasingly suspicious, I opened his laptop, which he often left, logged in. In his email, I found notifications from his eBay account. Clicking through, I discovered listings for several items, including my missing tablet, described as barely used and priced well below its value. When confronted, Greg's excuses flowed easily. I was just borrowing it to apply for jobs since my phone screen is too small. I must have forgotten to put it back. And the eBay listing with my tablet and the photos. His expression shifted between surprise, guilt, and then indignation so quickly I almost missed it. That's not your tablet, it's one just like it that I've had for ages. I needed some quick cash for an upcoming job interview. Greg, I can see the distinctive scratch on the case that happened when I dropped it last year. It's my tablet. The confrontation escalated into a shouting match that ended with Greg storming out, claiming I never trusted him and always thought the worst of him. Hours later, my tablet mysteriously reappeared on my desk and the eBay listing was deleted. That night I sat at my kitchen table long after Greg had gone to bed, staring at the walls of the home that no longer felt like mine, making a decision that would change everything. The tablet incident marked a turning point. I began documenting everything methodically, taking photos of my belongings, creating an inventory of anything valuable, and installing a small safe in my bedroom closet for my jewelry and important documents. I even took photos of the food in my refrigerator and pantry, noting how quickly items disappeared. My grocery bills had doubled, then tripled. Premium cuts of meat vanished overnight. Expensive bottles of wine I'd been saving for special occasions emptied mysteriously, the bottles appearing in the recycling bin with no mention from Greg. When I started keeping certain foods in a small refrigerator with a lock in my bedroom, Greg complained to our parents that I was food policing him. One morning I woke to find my car gone from the driveway. Panicked, I was about to call the police when Greg casually walked through the front door, tossing my keys onto the counter. "Where was my car?" I demanded. "Just borrowed it to meet a potential employer for breakfast," he said with a shrug. "My truck needs a new battery." "You took my car without asking, what if I had an early meeting?" "But you didn't," he countered. "Besides, family shares right. Isn't that what you're always preaching at me?" I stared at him, recognizing the twisted echo of my parents' manipulation. When I checked my gas gauge, the tank was nearly empty, though I had filled it just yesterday. The next day, my mother called with what she described as a small favor. Greg's car insurance lapsed, and with his credit situation, the quotes are just astronomical, she explained. "We were thinking, since he's using your address now anyway, maybe you could add him to your policy. Just temporarily, of course." I almost laughed at the absurdity. "Mom, I'm not adding Greg to my car insurance. He took my car without permission yesterday and returned it with no gas." "Oh, Ida, don't be so dramatic. He probably just forgot to fill it up. You know how absent-minded he can be." The excuses were always the same. Greg was absent-minded, he was going through a tough time, he just needed a little more support. And beneath it, all the implication that as the successful sibling it was my duty to carry the burden of his irresponsibility. That evening, collecting my mail, I found several envelopes addressed to Greg that had clearly been opened and then carelessly resealed, one from a credit card company, another from a collection agency. I confronted him about using my address for his financial dealings. "I had to list some address on the applications," he said defensively. "And technically I do live here now." "Temporarily," I corrected. "And I don't want my address associated with your debts." Greg rolled his eyes. "Always so worried about your precious credit score. Must be nice to have such privileged problems." The comment stung because it completely dismissed how hard I had worked to build my financial stability. Unlike Greg, no one had paid my way through the community college courses he had dropped out of, or covered my rent when I couldn't make ends meet, or bought me a new car when I totaled the first one driving drunk. Every bit of privilege I had was the result of years of saving, careful planning, and turning down the temptations of instant gratification that Greg always gave into. Curious about his employment history, I began discreetly asking around through mutual acquaintances and former coworkers. The picture that emerged was troubling. Greg hadn't been let go from his last 3 jobs, he had been fired. Once for consistent tardiness, once for missing cash from the register, and most recently for lying about having completed projects that were never even started. One former manager, after learning I was his sister, even warned me. "Keep your valuables locked up. Items kept disappearing when he worked here." The truth of my situation was becoming increasingly clear. I wasn't temporarily helping a brother down on his luck. I was being taken advantage of by someone with a pattern of exploitation and dishonesty. Then came the family dinner that revealed just how deep the expectations ran. My parents invited us both to their house, which was unusual since they typically preferred to come to my home now that Greg lived there. The evening started pleasantly enough with my mother serving Greg's favorite foods and my father discussing a baseball game with him. I was almost relaxed when my mother cleared her throat meaningfully as she served dessert. Ida, we've been thinking about Greg's situation, and we believe he needs a more comprehensive plan. I looked between them cautiously. What kind of plan? My father took over. Greg's been dealing with a lot of challenges. His therapist thinks... Wait, I interrupted. Greg has a therapist. Greg looked slightly embarrassed. Started seeing someone a few months back for anxiety and stuff. That's great, I said, genuinely impressed that he was seeking help. I think therapy can be really valuable. Exactly, my mother jumped in. And Dr. Patterson thinks Greg would benefit from longer-term stability. A solid year in one place with consistent support. The implications hit me. You're suggesting he live with me for a year. It makes the most sense, my father said firmly. You have the space, you're financially secure, and frankly, your brother needs the structure of being around someone as organized as you. Before I could respond, my mother added, and we think it would be beneficial if you could help cover the therapy costs. Just temporarily. Insurance doesn't cover doctor. Patterson, and at $400 per session, twice a month. I nearly choked on my coffee. You want me to pay $800 a month for Greg's therapy, and possibly contribute to a career counselor, my father added. Someone who specializes in helping people with Greg's unique talents find the right fit. I sat in stunned silence as they continued outlining a plan where I would essentially financially support Greg for at least a year while he found himself. Then my father dropped the final bombshell. The truth is, Ida, we need your help with Greg, because we've got our own situation. We co-signed on some of his loans a few years back, and now those debts are affecting our ability to retire. We're carrying almost $50,000 of his debt. My mother reached across the table to squeeze my hand. We've always been so proud of how well you've done. You're in a position to help us all out of this situation. Since you're doing so well financially, taking on Greg for a while seems like the least you could do for the family. In that moment, the full picture became clear. This wasn't about helping Greg temporarily. This was about making me permanently responsible for both my brother's lifestyle and my parents' financial decisions. They had enabled his behavior for years, and now that the consequences were catching up to them, they expected me to take over the role of Greg's supporter so they could wash their hands of the responsibility. The realization left me feeling cold. As I drove home that night with Greg chattering excitedly about the great solution our parents had come up with, I knew I needed professional advice about my rights and options. This situation had moved beyond family disagreement into something that threatened my financial future and well-being. The day after the revealing family dinner, I called Marissa, a lawyer friend I knew from college, and asked if we could meet for lunch. I needed objective advice from someone who understood both legal rights and the complexities of family dynamics. Over salads at a cafe far from my office or home, I explained the entire situation, the surprise move-in, the escalating demands, the missing items, and now the expectation that I would essentially become Greg's long-term financial supporter. First, Marisa said firmly, you need to understand that as the homeowner, you have rights. Regardless of family relationships, Greg is effectively a tenant in your home, but one without a formal agreement, which actually gives you more flexibility, not less. But he keeps talking about how he has rights as a resident now, I explained. He's trying to establish tenancy, which would give him certain protections, she explained. In most states, someone can claim tenancy rights after establishing residence for a certain period, usually 30 days. But as the homeowner, you still have the right to give notice and begin eviction proceedings if necessary. The word eviction made my stomach tighten. It sounded so harsh, so final, and yet wasn't that exactly what might be needed? Marisa continued outlining the steps I could take to protect myself legally while attempting to resolve the situation. I took detailed notes, feeling both empowered and saddened that my family situation had deteriorated to the point of needing legal advice. When I returned from my business trip the following week, I discovered that disaster had struck in my absence. Greg had apparently hosted what neighbors described as a massive party that had resulted in police being called due to noise complaints. My home office, which I had reclaimed after insisting Greg move into the actual guest room, was in shambles. Coffee spilled on important documents, my desk chair broken, and worst of all, wine spilled across my laptop, rendering it useless. Greg's explanation: "Things got a little out of hand, but it wasn't my fault. Someone I barely knew brought their friends and it snowballed. The damage to my work equipment meant I had to miss an important presentation, jeopardizing a promotion I had been working toward for months. My manager was understanding but clearly disappointed, and I could feel the opportunity slipping away as a colleague stepped in to handle the presentation instead. That evening, I received an unexpected call from a woman named Allison who identified herself as Greg's ex-girlfriend. "I hope you don't mind me contacting you," she began hesitantly. "I found your number in Greg's phone once and saved it, thinking I might need to reach family someday. I heard he's living with you now, and I thought you should know some things." Over the next hour, Allison painted a picture of my brother that aligned with my growing suspicions, but was far more calculated than I had imagined. According to her, Greg had a pattern of moving in with people friends, girlfriends, co-workers, establishing himself as a permanent fixture, and then gradually taking financial advantage of them. "He lived with me for 8 months, she explained. By the end, I was paying for everything: rent, food, his car payment, even his cell phone. When I finally put my foot down, he became verbally abusive, claimed half my furniture was his, and threatened to sue me for evicting him unlawfully. She described how Greg had used her address to open credit accounts, borrowed her car until it broke down, and managed to make her feel guilty for asking him to contribute. The parallels to my own situation were undeniable. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Because I wish someone had warned me," she said simply. "And because even though Greg and I ended badly, I don't hate him. He needs help, real help, not more enablers. His parents, your parents, they've been bailing him out his entire life. He's never had to face consequences." After thanking her for her honesty, I spent the evening researching, confirming what Allison had told me, and discovering more concerning information. I ran a credit check on myself and found multiple recent inquiries attempts to open credit cards in my name that had been denied due to security measures I had put in place years ago after a previous identity theft scare. The applications had all been submitted from my home IP address on days when I had been at work and Greg had been alone in the house. Armed with this evidence, I requested a family meeting at my parents' house away from Greg. I presented everything I had discovered: the credit applications, the statements from Greg's former employers, and Allison the extensive property damage and the pattern of exploitation. My parents' reactions were painfully predictable. My mother cried, insisting there must be some misunderstanding. My father grew defensive, suggesting I was exaggerating the situation because I had always been jealous of their relationship with Greg. "Everyone makes mistakes, Ida," my father said dismissively. "Greg is family. You don't turn your back on family when they're struggling. This isn't about mistakes I countered. This is about a pattern of behavior that you've enabled for years. And now you're asking me to take over that role because it's finally becoming too expensive for you." The conversation grew increasingly heated until my mother, in an apparent attempt to diffuse the tension, made a suggestion that left me speechless. Perhaps what would help everyone feel more secure is if Greg had some stability, some ownership. What if you signed over a percentage of your house to him? Just 20% to give him an asset and a sense of investment in maintaining the property. I stared at her, unable to believe what I was hearing. "You want me to give Greg part ownership of the home I saved for years to buy, the home he's actively damaging and taking advantage of?" "Well, when you put it like that, it sounds terrible," my mother said, her voice taking on the wounded tone she always used when challenged. "We're just trying to find solutions that work for everyone. Family helping family." I left their house that evening with a sense of clarity I hadn't felt in months. My parents were not neutral parties in this situation. They were active participants in exploiting my success to shield themselves from the consequences of enabling Greg's behavior for decades. That night, returning home, I found Greg asleep on the couch amid empty pizza boxes and beer cans. Quietly, I went to his room to retrieve a book I'd noticed was missing from my collection. While searching his cluttered space, I discovered a notebook tucked between his mattress and box spring. My moral qualms about invading his privacy were overcome by the need to protect myself, and what I found inside the notebook confirmed my worst fears. Detailed notes in Greg's handwriting outlined a plan to establish permanent residency in my home, gradually take over more space, and eventually claim partial ownership through what he called legal leverage, a strategy that involved documenting every dollar he allegedly spent on home improvement and creating a paper trail that suggested we had a partnership agreement. One page included a timeline with milestones. Month 1 to 2, establish basic residency rights. Month 3 to 4, begin receiving mail, establish legal address. Month 5 to 6, make minor improvements to property, save receipts. Month 7 to 8, raise issue of partial ownership as compensation for improvements. Month 9 to 10, if resistance encountered, mention potential for costly legal battle. Month 11 to 12, negotiate ownership percentage, or buyout. The final entry included a note: if Ida sells AIM for 30% of proceeds based on sweat equity and established residency, consult with Dad about legal precedents for unmarried cohabitation property rights. The mention of my father made me freeze. This wasn't just Greg's scheme my parents were advising him. The people who should have been protecting me from exploitation were actively facilitating it. In that moment, sitting on Greg's bed with his predatory plans literally in my hands, something broke inside me. The lifetime of putting family first, of accepting less so Greg could have more, of making excuses for their treatment of me, it all crystallized into a cold, clear certainty. This was no longer about being a good daughter or sister. This was about survival. And I would no longer set myself on fire to keep the rest of them warm. The next morning, I called in sick to work for the first time in 3 years. Instead of going to the office, I drove directly to Marissa's law firm and requested an emergency consultation. I need more than advice now, I told her, sliding Greg's notebook across her desk. I need a strategy. Over the next 2 hours, Marissa and I developed a comprehensive plan. As she explained, my situation had moved beyond a simple family disagreement into potential fraud and conspiracy territory. Your brother is attempting to establish rights to your property through deception and manipulation, she said, flipping through his notes. And based on these references to your father, it appears your parents are advising him. This changes our approach significantly. The first step was documentation, creating an unimpeachable record of everything that had occurred and was continuing to happen. That afternoon, I purchased small legal security cameras and installed them in the common areas of my home, living room, kitchen hallways, and exterior doorways. I made sure they were visible rather than hidden, as Marissa had advised. This wasn't about catching Greg unawares. It was about creating a deterrent and establishing clear evidence if needed. When Greg returned home that evening and noticed the cameras, his reaction was revealing. Rather than the outrage or indignation an innocent person might express, he became calculating, asking careful questions about what areas were covered and whether the footage was stored or live-streamed. Just a security precaution, I explained casually. After the party incident, I want to make sure my property is protected. The subtle emphasis on my property wasn't lost on him, and I could almost see him recalibrating his approach. The cameras marked the beginning of a strange new phase in our cohabitation. Greg became more careful, more strategic in his actions. He cleaned up after himself more consistently, spoke more politely when he knew he was being recorded, and even made a show of job hunting at the kitchen table, where cameras could capture his apparent diligence. But other behaviors escalated. He began spending more time in his room with the door closed. His friends no longer came over, but he was frequently absent, returning late at night. Mail addressed to him increased dramatically. More credit card offers, banking documents, even subscription services that required a permanent address. Following Marissa's advice, I drafted a formal written notice stating that Greg's permission to stay in my home would end in 30 days. The document, which Marissa reviewed for legal sufficiency, outlined the reasons for termination of housing, unauthorized use of my personal property, damage to the home, violation of verbal agreements regarding length of stay, and misuse of my address for financial purposes. I presented the notice to Greg in front of one of the cameras, maintaining a calm, businesslike demeanor, as I explained that his residency would end on June 15th, giving him a full month to secure alternative housing. Greg's response was a dismissive laugh. "This isn't how it works, sis. I live here now. I've established residency. You can't just kick me out because you're in a bad mood." "This isn't about my mood," I replied evenly. "This is a legal notice to vacate delivered more than the required time before the termination date. I've outlined the reasons, which are well documented. If you need resources for finding new housing, I'm happy to provide them." His expression hardened. "You might want to talk to Mom and Dad before you go down this road. They won't be happy about you throwing your own brother out on the street." "My relationship with Mom and Dad isn't relevant to our housing arrangement. I said, sticking to the language Marisa had coached me to use. This is between you and me as homeowner and resident. As predicted, my parents' reaction was immediate and explosive. My mother called in tears, my father in rage. I was accused of being heartless, selfish, cruel, a failure as a daughter and sister. The lifetime of conditioning to yield, to accommodate, to sacrifice my needs for family harmony made these accusations painful, despite my intellectual understanding of the manipulation at play. If you do this to your brother, you are no longer our daughter, my father finally declared. Don't expect to be included in family events. Don't expect support when you need it. You will be on your own. The threat cutting me off from family might have worked in the past, but now, with clear evidence of their conspiracy to take advantage of me, it only strengthened my resolve. I understand your position, I replied, maintaining the calm, detached tone that seemed to infuriate them most. My decision stands. As the 30-day notice period progressed, I continued gathering evidence and securing my position. I documented every interaction with Greg, backed up camera footage daily, and kept Marisa updated on developments. I also began quietly consulting with a real estate agent about the potential value of my home in the current market. Greg's behavior became increasingly concerning. Items around the house began to show mysterious damage, small things at first easily dismissed as accidents. A chip in a kitchen countertop, a stain on the carpet that hadn't been there before, the garbage disposal that suddenly stopped working. But as the move-out date approached, the damage became more significant and harder to dismiss as coincidental. A leaking pipe under the bathroom sink that caused water damage to the cabinetry. A broken window in the guest bedroom that Greg claimed must have been caused by a neighborhood kid's baseball. 3 large scratches across the hardwood floor that appeared after Greg moved furniture to vacuum underneath. I documented everything meticulously, taking before and after photos, noting dates and circumstances. When I confronted Greg about the pattern of damage, his response chilled me. "Seems like your perfect house isn't holding up too well," he remarked with a shrug. "Probably losing value every day. Might be smart to sell while you can still get a decent price." I know Dad's friend Jack is a real estate investor always looking for fixer-uppers. The implication was clear. The damage was intentional, designed to devalue my home and pressure me into selling, likely to someone connected to my father who would offer below market value and potentially create a situation where Greg could remain as a tenant. The 30-day notice period came and went. On the morning of day 31, I calmly asked Greg about his moving plans. "Yeah, about that," he said, lounging on my couch with his feet up on my coffee table. "I've been talking to a buddy who knows tenant law. Turns out I've established legal residency here. You want me out, you'll need to file a formal eviction, which could take months. And with my documented improvements to the property, I might have a claim to equity. Could get messy." "What improvements?" I asked, genuinely curious about what he would claim. "Fixed the garage door opener when it was sticking. Replaced some light bulbs. General maintenance stuff. Plus, all the cleaning I've done." He gestured vaguely around the room that he had, in fact, not cleaned once during his stay. "I see," I said neutrally, revealing nothing of my plans. "I'll look into the legal requirements." That evening, while reviewing security footage from when I'd been at work, I discovered something that changed everything. Greg had brought my parents to the house during my absence. The cameras captured them walking through each room, discussing the value of furniture pieces and debating which items would work in Greg's new place. My father could be clearly heard explaining to Greg how to file for squatters' rights and suggesting they should start moving key items to storage before Ida escalates things. My mother's voice added, "Once she realizes she'll have to sell the house to resolve this, we can suggest she sell to Jack at a family discount. He already said he'd be happy to rent to Greg at a reduced rate since they're golf buddies. Everyone wins." Everyone except me, of course. In one of the final clips, my father could be seen examining property documents I kept in my home office. The mortgage is solely in her name, which is good. Less complication. If we can get her to sign a quitclaim deed giving Greg even 5% interest in the property to resolve this amicably, he'll have leverage to force a sale on his timeline. The evidence of conspiracy was now indisputable. My own parents and brother were plotting to pressure me into surrendering my home through a combination of legal, intimidation, property damage, and emotional manipulation. I forwarded the footage to Marisa, along with all my other documentation. Her response was immediate. We need to move to phase 2. How soon can you be ready? I looked around at the home I had loved now, filled with tension and betrayal. I'm ready now, I replied. The plan Marisa and I had developed was comprehensive and required precise timing. I requested a 2-week emergency leave from work, explaining to my sympathetic manager that I was dealing with a complex family situation involving potential legal issues. With my professional obligations temporarily paused, I could focus entirely on executing our strategy. The first step involved securing all my valuables and important documents. Over the course of 2 days while Greg was out with friends, I methodically gathered my jewelry, family heirlooms, financial paperwork, and irreplaceable personal items. These were relocated to a safety deposit box at my bank and a small storage unit I rented under a LLC. Marisa had helped me establish for privacy. Next came the detailed inventory and documentation phase. I hired a professional appraiser to assess the value of my home both in its current condition and what it would be worth without the recent damage. I also had the appraiser document the condition of each room with photographs and notes, creating an official record of the property's state. The security camera footage of Greg and my parents discussing their scheme was backed up in multiple secure locations. The most challenging phase involved my personal possessions. I contracted with a moving company that specialized in rapid confidential relocations, explaining that I was leaving a difficult domestic situation and needed discretion. Over 2 days when Greg was again absent, this time on what he described as a promising job interview, but was actually a golf outing with my father, according to my location, tracking the movers efficiently packed and removed all of my furniture, clothing, and personal items, transferring everything to a second larger storage unit. I left behind only the furnishings in Greg's room, and the common areas items that were easily replaceable or that I was willing to sacrifice to maintain the illusion that nothing had changed. To casual observation, the house still appeared lived in, though significantly emptier. The final and most critical piece of the plan was put in motion on a Thursday morning. I met with a real estate agent who specialized in quick sales, signing the paperwork to list my house as is, for a price that was below market value but would ensure rapid interest. By that afternoon, a for sale sign stood prominently in my front yard, and online listings with photographs carefully taken to exclude the damaged areas went live on all major real estate platforms. I then checked into a hotel under my LLC's name where I would be staying until the situation resolved. Everything was in place. Now I simply had to wait. The reaction came faster than even Marisa had anticipated. At 6:15 that evening, my phone exploded with notifications. First a text from Greg, "What the hell is this sign in the yard?" Then voicemails from both parents. My father's message so angry the words were barely distinguishable, my mother's tearful and accusatory. I didn't respond to any of them, following Marisa's advice to maintain communication silence until they were forced to recognize the new reality. By 8 o'clock that night, all 3 of them had arrived at the house, based on the security camera alerts I received. I watched remotely as they moved through the rooms, their shock at finding most of my possessions gone evident in their expressions and frantic conversations. My father attempted to remove the for sale sign from the yard, but discovered it had been secured with a locked chain, a precaution my real estate agent had suggested based on previous experience with disputed property sales. The next morning, I received the call I had been waiting for from Marisa, not my family. "They've contacted an attorney," she informed me. As expected, they're threatening to challenge the sale based on Greg's claimed tenancy rights. Their lawyer reached out to open negotiations. And I asked, my heart pounding despite our preparation for this exact scenario. I informed them that we have extensive evidence of conspiracy to defraud you of your property, including recorded conversations detailing their plan. I offered to send sample clips for their review before we proceed with filing criminal charges. There was a pause, and I could hear the satisfaction in Marisa's voice when she continued. "They've requested a meeting. All parties, both attorneys. Neutral location." The meeting was set for the following day at Marisa's office. I arrived early, professionally dressed, and projecting a calm I didn't entirely feel. My parents and Greg arrived together, my father's expression thunderous, my mother's tearful, and Greg's uncharacteristically subdued. Their attorney, an older man who apparently golfed with my father, began with blustering accusations about my ambush tactics and family betrayal. Marisa let him finish, before calmly placing a tablet on the conference table and playing selected clips from my security footage. The color drained from my father's face as his own voice filled the room detailing the plan to force me to sell my house. Greg stared at the table, unable to meet anyone's eyes, while my mother dabbed at tears that seemed more panicked than sorrowful now. When the clips ended, Marisa outlined my position with clinical precision. My client has documented evidence of a conspiracy to defraud her of her property through coercion, property damage, and abuse of familial relationship. She has recordings of discussions about filing false claims of property interest, deliberate strategies to devalue her home, and explicit plans to manipulate her into selling under market value to a pre-selected buyer connected to your clients. She placed a folder on the table. This contains screenshots of unauthorized credit applications submitted in my client's name from her home IP address during hours when only Mr. Thompson was present in the home. It also includes documentation of property damage exceeding $20,000, theft of personal property, and evidence of planned perjury regarding fictitious home improvements. Their lawyer looked increasingly uncomfortable as Marisa continued. My client is prepared to proceed with both civil claims and criminal charges against all three of your clients. Alternatively, she is offering the following terms for resolution. She slid a document across the table outlining my conditions. Greg would vacate the property immediately with no claim to residency or ownership. My parents and Greg would sign legal acknowledgments that they had no financial interest in my property. All three would agree to cease contact with me for a period of no less than 1 year, with any future contact to be initiated by me alone, if and when I chose to resume communication. If these terms are accepted today, Marisa concluded, my client will not pursue criminal charges or civil damages for the documented theft, property damage, and conspiracy. The house sale will proceed, and all parties will go their separate ways. If these terms are not accepted, we will file the complete evidence package with the district attorney's office this afternoon. The silence that followed was deafening. Finally, their lawyer asked for a few minutes to confer with his clients privately. Marisa and I stepped out waiting in a small conference room across the hall. Do you think they'll agree? I asked quietly. They don't have a choice, she replied. The evidence is overwhelming. Your father as a business owner can't risk a fraud charge. It would destroy his company. Greg could face actual jail time for the identity theft attempts and documented property damage. They'll sign. She was right. 20 minutes later, we were called back in. The atmosphere had changed dramatically. My father subdued my mother, no longer crying but sitting with rigid posture, Greg looking almost relieved that the charade was ending. Their lawyer cleared his throat. My clients are prepared to accept your terms with one modification. They request that the no-contact period be mutual and limited to 6 months, rather than a year, with the possibility of family counseling at that point if all parties agree. Marisa looked to me for direction. After a moment's consideration, I nodded. Acceptable, but with the explicit understanding that any future contact must be consensual for all involved. No showing up unannounced, no using third parties to pressure me, no manipulating mutual acquaintances to relay messages. The papers were signed within the hour. Greg agreed to remove his remaining possessions by the end of the following day, supervised by a representative from Marisa's office to ensure no additional damage occurred. My parents committed to staying away from the property entirely during the sale process. As we prepared to leave, my mother finally spoke directly to me, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't understand how you could do this to your family. I looked at her for a long moment, seeing not just my mother, but the woman who had taught me from childhood that my needs were secondary, that Greg's comfort was always the priority, that my role was to accommodate and enable regardless of the cost to myself. That's exactly the problem, I replied quietly. You never understood that I deserve the same consideration and respect as the rest of the family. Today is the day that changed. With those words, I walked out of the conference room and out of the toxic family dynamic that had defined my life for 34 years. The 6 months following the confrontation in Marisa's office were transformative. Free from the emotional and financial drain of supporting Greg and managing my parents' manipulations, I could finally focus on rebuilding my life on my terms. The house sold within 2 weeks of listing, despite the damage Greg had caused. The as-is pricing strategy had attracted multiple investors looking for properties to renovate, resulting in a bidding war that actually pushed the final sale price above my initial asking figure. While still below what the house would have been worth in perfect condition, the proceeds were substantial enough to give me a fresh start. I used part of the money to rent a comfortable apartment in a secure building across town while I considered my long-term plans. The remainder was invested for my future, something that would have been impossible if I had continued financing Greg's lifestyle and debts as my parents had intended. True to the agreement, my family maintained their distance. Occasionally, I would see their names on my caller ID or recognize my mother's handwriting on an envelope, but I exercised my right to choose when and how communication might eventually resume. Those boundaries, once unthinkable in our family dynamic, became the foundation of my healing process. Professionally, I flourished. The promotion I had feared losing came through after I returned from leave and delivered an outstanding presentation on a new project. My manager, who had been supportive throughout my personal crisis, noted that my work had become even more focused and innovative. Sometimes clearing out personal baggage releases creative energy, she remarked, not knowing how profoundly true that was in my case. As the 6-month mark of our separation approached, I received a formal letter from my parents. Unlike their previous communications, which typically oscillated between guilt-inducing pleas and thinly veiled demands, this letter was respectful of my boundaries. They expressed interest in gradually rebuilding our relationship, suggested meeting on neutral ground with a family therapist present, and most surprisingly acknowledged that their treatment of me had been unfair throughout my life. I shared the letter with my own therapist, whom I had been seeing weekly to process the complex emotions surrounding my family estrangement. This shows progress, she observed, but remember that acknowledging past behavior and actually changing patterns are very different things. Any reconciliation should proceed at your pace with clear boundaries and evidence of sustained change. Her wisdom guided my cautious response. I agreed to a single session with a family therapist, specifying that Greg would not be present for this initial meeting and that no living arrangements or financial assistance would be discussed. The session was difficult but productive. My parents seemed genuinely shocked when the therapist helped me articulate the pattern of inequality and exploitation that had defined our family dynamic. Whether their surprise was genuine or performative remained unclear, but they appeared to be listening in a way they never had before. "We always thought we were helping Greg because he struggled more than you did," my mother explained tearfully. "You were so capable, so independent. We didn't realize we were putting all the burden on you." "Intention doesn't erase impact," the therapist noted gently. Ida experienced years of having her needs deprioritized, her boundaries violated, and her success exploited. My father, always quicker to defend than reflect initially, tried to minimize the situation. Every family has a different dynamic with each child. We didn't mean any harm. Yet harm was done, I said quietly. And it culminated in an actual conspiracy to take my home, the one thing I had built entirely through my own efforts, with no support from any of you. That reality stated plainly without accusation, but a simple fact seemed to finally penetrate. My father's expression shifted from defensive to something I had rarely seen chastened. We agreed to continue with monthly family therapy sessions, maintaining other boundaries in between. Greg remained a separate issue. He had made no attempt to contact me directly, though I occasionally heard updates through extended family. Apparently he had moved in with a cousin temporarily before finding a job at a friend's landscaping company and renting a small apartment. For perhaps the first time in his adult life, he was supporting himself without family subsidies. Meanwhile, I was making plans of my own. The real estate market in my city had become increasingly expensive, making homeownership challenging even for professionals with good incomes. I began researching opportunities in other locations and discovered a growing tech hub in Colorado with both career potential and a more affordable housing market. 8 months after the confrontation that had changed everything, I accepted a senior development position with a company in Denver that offered both advancement potential and the flexibility of partial remote work. Within weeks, I had purchased a beautiful Mountain View property, smaller than my previous home, but entirely mine, with enhanced security features and no spare bedroom for unexpected guests. As I settled into my new community, something unexpected began to happen. Extended family members, with whom I had maintained only casual contact over the years, began reaching out. First came my mother's sister, Aunt Jean, who had always seemed quietly supportive but never intervened in our family dynamics. I saw the favoritism all those years, she confided during a long phone call. "I tried to talk to your mother about it, but she always defended their approach. I should have been more direct with you, let you know that I saw what was happening. I'm sorry I didn't do more." Her acknowledgement was healing in a way I hadn't anticipated. Other relatives followed, cousins who had observed the pattern at family gatherings, an uncle who admitted he had enabled the situation by always giving Greg emergency loans that were never repaid. Each conversation reinforced that I hadn't been imagining or exaggerating the inequality. Others had seen it too, but constrained by family loyalty or conflict avoidance had remained silent. These conversations helped me understand that the problem wasn't just my immediate family, but a broader system that had tacitly permitted the exploitation to continue. This insight prompted me to become more intentional about creating my own support network of friends and colleagues who demonstrated reciprocity and respect for boundaries. A year and a half after the dramatic break with my family, I received an unexpected email from Alice and Greg's ex-girlfriend who had warned me about his patterns. She was moving to Denver for a job opportunity and wondered if we might meet for coffee. That casual meeting developed into a friendship built on mutual understanding of what we had both experienced with Greg and our shared commitment to healthier relationships. Through Allison, I eventually learned that my confrontation had created ripple effects I never anticipated. Apparently being cut off from his primary enablers, our parents had forced Greg to finally face consequences for his actions. The cousin he had briefly lived with had maintained strict boundaries, refusing to provide financial support beyond temporary housing. For the first time in his life, Greg had no choice but to either support himself or face homelessness. Last I heard, he's still with the landscaping company Allison told me during a hiking trip in the mountains near my new home. He even got promoted to crew supervisor. His friend says he's different now, more responsible, actually showing up on time, managing money better. I received this news with cautious optimism. While I had no immediate interest in re-establishing contact with Greg, I was genuinely glad if he was finally building a sustainable life. Perhaps the enforced separation had been beneficial for him too, in ways none of us had anticipated. As for my parents, our carefully managed reconciliation continued slowly. The monthly therapy sessions eventually transitioned to occasional family dinners when I visited my hometown, always in public restaurants rather than private homes, always with clear start and end times. They were learning gradually and imperfectly to respect my boundaries. I was learning to maintain those boundaries without the crushing guilt that had previously accompanied any act of self-protection. 2 years after the dramatic confrontation that had changed everything, I sat on the deck of my mountain home watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. My laptop was open to a half-finished email. A younger colleague at my company had reached out for advice, describing a situation with her roommate that raised alarming flags of financial exploitation and boundary violations. I don't want to damage our friendship, she had written, but I feel like I'm being taken advantage of. How do I address this without causing a huge conflict? My response was the distillation of everything I had learned through my painful journey. Healthy relationships, whether family, friendship, or romance, are built on mutual respect, particularly respect for boundaries. When someone consistently violates your boundaries despite clear communication, they are demonstrating that their desires matter more to them than your well-being. That isn't friendship, it's exploitation. The conflict already exists. You're just deciding whether to acknowledge it openly or continue suffering in silence. Setting boundaries isn't causing a problem, it's responding to one that's already there. And sometimes the most compassionate thing you can do, both for yourself and ultimately for them, is to stop enabling behavior that harms everyone involved in the long run. As I finished typing, I realized how far I had come from the person who had stood frozen in her doorway 2 years ago, discovering that her most basic boundaries had been violated by the people who should have been protecting them. That person had been conditioned to sacrifice herself for family harmony. This person, the woman I had become, understood that true harmony could never be built on one person's systematic exploitation. The journey hadn't been easy. There had been moments of doubt, of grief for the family relationships I had always longed for but never truly had. There had been practical challenges of rebuilding my life in a new location. But there had also been profound discovery of my own strength, of authentic connections with people who valued reciprocity, of the peace that comes from living in alignment with your own values rather than others' expectations. The most valuable lesson wasn't that family can betray you, though. That was certainly true in my case. The most important insight was that we have the power to redefine what family means, to create chosen connections based on mutual respect and genuine care, rather than remaining trapped in dynamics that demand sacrifice without reciprocity. Sometimes the bravest and most loving thing we can do is to say enough to ourselves as much as to others. In finding the courage to protect myself, I had discovered a capacity for authentic connection that would have remained impossible had I continued in the role of family enabler and sacrifice. As the last light faded from the sky, I closed my laptop and breathed deeply of the mountain air. This home, this life, this sense of peace, these were the fruits of the difficult but necessary decision to value my own well-being. And in doing so, I had unknowingly created the opportunity for everyone involved to grow beyond the unhealthy patterns that had confined us all. What about you? Have you ever had to set difficult boundaries with family members or close friends who were taking advantage of your kindness? How did you find the courage to stand up for yourself, and what happened afterward? I'd love to hear your experiences in the comments below. And if this story resonated with you, please like, subscribe, and share it with someone who might need to hear that it's okay to protect yourself even from the people you love. Thank you for listening to my journey, and I wish you strength and clarity in your own path toward healthy relationships built on genuine respect and care.